Vicky, you said right at the beginning of your talk, you talked about ultra-low emission vehicles. What is an ultra-low emission vehicle? What does that mean? And just for the basics of it, how does that compare to an electric vehicle? What does it mean?
So I suppose the definition of ultra-low emission vehicle is not as clear as it could be. But so in government, it basically means full battery electric vehicles with a completely zero emission range, hydrogen vehicles, so fuel cell electric vehicles with a completely zero emission range, and plug-in hybrids with a good. So basically, you plug them in so you can run them off of the battery, and that kind of sort of simplifies, I think, how we in OLEV view that.
Is it the same thing as zero emissions, or is it something different?
They can all be run. So I suppose I find it helpful to think in terms of zero emission capability. They can all be run in zero emission mode, and I think that's the really important part of this.
Okay, Colin, you talked about energy networks with the cars sort of being connected to the homes, etc. Can you just make the link? Can you give an example of if in 30 years' time you're driving home in your electric car, you plug it in, and you're still connected to the grid? How is it part of the grid? How is that car part of the grid? How is it storing energy at peak times or giving it back at other not peak times?
The easiest way to look at it is if the grid is stressed, we can do reverse. So it can stop me charging and in theory take out of my battery. The logic is this works with thousands of vehicles aggregated, and it would work in big bus depots. So instead of having containers full of batteries that the grid can call on, basically it's calling on car parks.
So the cars are basically your distributed storage.
Yes.
You're driving around.
Yeah. And when I come home, I'm just an individual in a part of a big picture. If you want to be really naughty like me, I could charge at work, go home and sell it to the grid.
Right. Someone's going to have thought of that, right. Peter, just building on that point, you talked about the car as a larger part of your life. And I get the idea of a car having GPS and Bluetooth and all these funky things like that. I mean, I think I've even been in a Tesla which speaks to you, and that's lovely. But what else can a car do? How can it be a bigger part of your life than these connections that you talked about? What does it mean?
I mean, I think Colin touched on it just now in terms of the way it can integrate into the energy network, so it can support the network. It means that you can generate potentially a revenue. You're making your battery, your storage, that has a value for the energy system. You're offering that and that you can get a revenue stream from that. I think more generally, I know how impatient I get when I hit a mobile phone not spot. And the thought of being out of connection the whole time. I think we are living our lives now where we expect 100% reliable, 24/7 connectivity. And I think that will have to apply to the vehicle as well. The thought of suddenly driving up the M6 and being out of touch, I think consumer demand will just move far beyond that there will be an expectation that our connected world is available to us all the time.
And that means also being able to charge your car wherever you go without any worries about it at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think the research that from consumers, they say the number one concern that they have is having confidence that they can charge when they need to charge.
But a lot of people worry about range, don't they? Except that most car journeys are less than 10 miles, and that's easily doable with an electric car, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two challenges there. I think one, we don't understand and we're not conscious of how we use the car. I think we overestimate how much we drive and the long journeys that we do drive. And I think the second point then is that you know what? I've completely forgotten what that second point was. It was an absolute doozy, but it's gone.
Keep thinking. It'll come back to it. And Joe, just finally, so Shell obviously is an oil and gas company that wants to transition its ways through work you're doing into something that looks towards the future of electric. I just wonder, do you see the companies like yours eventually becoming fully renewable or anything like that? I mean, you're still going to be looking for oil and gas in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, so it's important we remember that our energy system today is 80% fossil fuels, and this transition takes time. So we've heard 1 million cars as a target for 2022. We've heard 50% new cars by 2030, at least. Yeah. This transition takes time, and we need to fuel the vehicles that we've currently driving in the meantime. So yes, we are still investing in oil and gas, but we want to be part of this transition. We see it as a really exciting
So what's in
opportunity.
it for you to be thinking like that? What, for Shell?
Survival, ultimately. We have basically three strategic ambitions going forward: to be a world-class investment case, and we are, but we want to continue being that, thriving through the energy transition so that we're one of the biggest energy companies in the world in 100 years' time as we are today, and maintaining a strong societal license to operate. And those three go hand in hand on this journey.
Thank you. Okay, so let's take some more questions from the audience, and we have one right here. So just tell us who you are, and if your question is directed to anyone in particular, let us know.
I'm a chemist. Sorry,
Yeah, well, we can hear you.
okay, I'm a chemist and I work for a large chemical engineering contractor. And several observations. First of all, I think the general consensus is that we will not be able to do our domestic heating without converting our natural gas grid back to hydrogen, because we will not all be able to have water heaters in our houses and have enough electricity to do this, as well as road transport. Accepting that, are all vehicles going to be electric, or are a large proportion of them going to be hydrogen vehicles? And then how are we going to generate the hydrogen? Well, there's big pushes, and we don't fund fusion research, electricity enough, and then we could have electrolysis and produce our hydrogen that way without fossil fuels. And the other one is about batteries. We're all talking about using car batteries. Well, the largest user of a battery or electrolysis technology is in fact winning copper. And for that, you haven't got the restriction of needing a small battery or a low-weight battery. You can have a very large system with copper sulfate or sodium chloride with membrane electrodes. You go back to anything that's got the right difference in the electrochemical series, and you can produce a battery without using all the exotic materials: copper, zinc, tin, sodium chloride, copper sulfate. And you can have a big tank of these things, and it is known technology. It's a technology we use to produce all the copper in the world. So, think about batteries that don't have a great weight or a great volume. They can have. You can have them fixed in one location and feed the grid with them, with known and relatively cheap technology without using exotic materials.
Thank you. Joe, do you want to take the first part of that question?
Yeah, I'm not qualified for the second part, but the hydrogen bit I can comment on. So we have an approach, we talk about a mosaic of fuels. Clearly in the in the ULEV space, EVs are ahead of hydrogen today. But we actually have 3 hydrogen refueling stations around London, and we've got plans in place for 3 more, supported by OLEV. And in places like Germany and in California, we've built, we're in parts of networks of 70 or so hydrogen refueling stations. So we do see a future for hydrogen as well, alongside. What we find today, because it's so earlier in the game, Alok talked about if you install an EV charge point today, how many people are likely to visit it? With a hydrogen station, you can kind of take a decimal place off that almost. You might get 1 visit a week. So there's a sort of step-by-step process with this. But what we're finding works best is working with fleets. So in London, we're working with people like Green Tomato Cars, am I allowed to mention names? And the Met Police, who have fleets of vehicles that they want to be able to, perhaps don't want to be able to charge for half an hour, and they want to be able to go for longer journeys, if you're the Met Police in particular. Where will the hydrogen come from? Well, obviously it's got to be clean hydrogen. So today the world uses quite a lot of hydrogen, and it's all made from natural gas. It's used in chemical processes, and we store a lot of hydrogen as well under the ground. In the future, it can either come, as you said, from renewable electricity with electrolysis, and the other way is that we put carbon capture and storage on the back end of producing it from natural gas. I think we'll see both in the UK in the future. So today, our hydrogen refueling stations are using electrolysis. And it's using renewable electricity off the grid. It's the only way in which we can produce clean hydrogen today. But there's a lot of excitement, and we're working with a lot of other parties to look at how we can develop carbon capture and storage, and part of that is to provide the mass scale of hydrogen that we will need in the future.
Thank you, Jay.
One of the challenges with hydrogen is the efficiency is really, really bad. So by the time you do the full cycle efficiency, you use about 3 times as much electricity per mile as a battery vehicle. So one of the challenges is, how do you get that efficiency up? At the moment, speaking frankly, there's only 2 car companies interested in doing it, and they're making cars. There's been a lot of noise over the last 10 years. About 10 years ago, I drove in a Nissan hydrogen car in Japan and have made nothing since. So there's actually no sign of the European manufacturers producing it. Unfortunately, yesterday in Norway, a hydrogen filling station blew up and injured a couple of people. And they've shut down all hydrogen filling stations, and Toyota and Hyundai have stopped selling vehicles. The problem with this is the fear with hydrogen is always explosions. So what happened yesterday is the worst possible thing that could have happened for hydrogen. But the efficiency is a problem that nobody solved. So when people say we need a lot of power stations for battery cars, we need 3 times as many for hydrogen cars.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Just one more up here, and then we'll move over the road. Tell us who you are.
Oh, hi, my name's Stan. Basically, a few weeks ago I saw on German television a program about the mining of some of the metals for these batteries. I think it was it lithium or cobalt? And I think it was somewhere in South America, maybe Argentina. And what they highlighted there was that whilst we're trying to get rid of one pollutant, CO2, we're producing an enormous amount of pollution in mining these materials, destroying local tribal areas, using salt water to flush it out. So my question really is, what is the downside of all this? How are we going to avoid producing more pollution than we actually are removing? How are the batteries going to be recycled? What's going to happen to all these metals? And ultimately, is there enough of this metal in the ground to supply us for 10, 20, 50 years?
Well, a few questions there, which I think probably is the subject of an entire debate. But can you touch on that?
Yeah, I'll kick this off. I mean, I think it's a valid concern in terms of looking at the sustainability of the supply chain for electric vehicles, lithium, cobalt, some of the rare earths. I think that's a valid concern, particularly as we see demand increasing. I think what we're seeing, though, at the moment is the first wave of technology development. And if we think about the waste hierarchy in terms of thinking about reuse before you're thinking about recycling, I think there are opportunities that will come from second life use that is offered there that could give your average lithium-ion battery a 20-year life before you then think about recycling. And if I can do a plug for our host, the Faraday Institution, one of the things I think is particularly interesting that they're looking at is the recycling process off the back of that. How can we make sure that we capture as much value as possible? And just linking on to the earlier question, I think at the moment what we have is a dominant technology in terms of lithium-ion, but we are going to see new technologies coming forward, and I think this is a really exciting area of research into new chemistries for battery technology that will come forward that is being driven by the market and being, the rate of change and the extent to which battery technology has developed in the last 10 years is phenomenal, and I think we'll just see that continue to accelerate.
Vicky, the government must be thinking about what you're doing with these batteries after the increase in them. What's the sort of way of incentivizing people to invest in sustainable batteries, making sure that there is a cycle afterwards?
Yeah, so I think Peter's touched on it actually. So I think part of the Faraday work is to look at recycling, and also I mentioned it. There are opportunities for the UK to capture that market. So there aren't many battery recycling facilities in the world. It is a problem. You're right, but the whole of the battery can be reused. So not only in kind of reuse, but also when you break it down, you can reuse all those component parts. So I think there's a real opportunity there. And as Peter said, the Faraday Institute are doing work on that, and how can the UK kind of work that up into a scalable facility. I think there's the big issue is not necessarily so much lithium, but the cobalt. Am I right in saying there are people here who know more than I? And again, there's an awful lot of research going into solid-state batteries, which would take that component of the battery out. So I think, again, it's kind of for government's role is to make sure that we're putting the R&D funding into the right places to help facilitate the UK's role in development of these sustainable technologies.
Okay, well, let's go for one more question here then. Martin, if you would go over there. Oh, you've got a question. Oh, let's have some questions here. I didn't see. Let's have any questions here? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Charles Yates, proud Northeasterner, but now living in London. And I wanted to bring London into this and a specific example, because for me, it helps highlight issues and make them real. Very happy using electric buses in central London, and I understand TfL would dearly love to have more, but they can't because of limits on the charging capacity for these buses in central London depots. You know, what's the solution to that problem? Is it more infrastructure? Is it better technology? And how soon is it going to come?
I think you can answer that question.
One of the things I find interesting about the limitations in this country is everybody celebrated when London bought 150 electric buses and Shenzhen bought 15,000. Right? It's scale. So at the moment, one of the interesting things, and the mayor's strategy is being launched next week, one of the things we're looking at is if you increase the capacity of a bus depot for its power, during the day the buses are out. So can you actually make money out of that charging infrastructure during the day? So going back to the picture I had of everything being interconnected, TfL's got its own grid, it's got its own network. So now what we're doing is throwing everything on the table and saying, hang on a minute, we're not just talking about buses being charged as buses, could we use some other way of using that infrastructure? And the other thing is UKPN have actually mapped all the hot spots and cold spots of power in London. And one of the interesting things is we built an infrastructure that we've got now, and interestingly on the motorways, so this is quite controversial, maybe we need to move the motorway services to where the power is instead of taking the power to where the bus depots are. Because the bus depots are there for a reason, that reason might have gone. So we might have to move bus depots to where there's a lot of power.
Can you give me an example of what you might do with that power in a bus depot? What other ways are you going to be able to use it?
Well, one of the challenges is buses charge AC and cars rapid charge DC. But there are other vehicles who work on a delivery cycle. So perhaps if the bus is out for the day, I'm using a name like UPS or DHL, maybe they use the bus depot for their charging and then they go out to work and it becomes a shared facility.
Okay. More questions over here.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations to the four speakers. I thought you've been superb so far this evening. I've got a very basic, prosaic sort of question. I often, because I live down near Folkestone, I often pop across the continent for 2 or 3 days. How far forward are our European neighbours?
Who can answer that question? Yeah.
Go on, Jules.
We can all have a go.
How far forward are European, sorry?
European neighbours.
In charging.
I suppose in charging infrastructure
Yeah,
and electric vehicles.
Again, Colin, you probably, but so I think there is a good charging network in Europe. I think it's, often the UK actually gets criticised sometimes for not having as good an interoperable network. So there's some quite big providers over there with contactless payment, which is an easy way for people to pull up to the charge point. The UK has a homegrown charging industry. So we have quite a few SMEs, particularly for slow and fast chargers in cities and on driveways and some of the public charge points as well. So I think part of what we've done is try to, with the Act of Parliament that I mentioned, is try to emulate some of the charging capability that there is on the continent. I think others will probably know exactly how many charge points are there over there if you're doing a drive across France. I do know France and Germany both have ambitions for charge points, so they have ambitions to roll out a certain number of charge points. Again, within the UK, we're doing pretty well on it, but we are looking at whether we should be doing something similar or something slightly more sophisticated in terms of where those charge points should be. So I think, it is there. It's the one journey you might take where you want to drive to the Alps or something, but it is possible. with a lot of planning.
Yeah,
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on one particular project that I know we've been involved in, which is looking at connected corridors, looking at the link down the A2, down across the border and across into France. And I think looking at that integrated approach, looking at transport corridors and thinking about how you can make those work, I think is very strong and is going to be really important.
Can I make one
Yes,
remark
please.
as well? I think, I mean, you've already touched on it, but one of the things we're missing in the UK is interoperability of charging schemes. So we actually have as many charge points almost as we need in the UK. You know, research tells us people want one about every 20 miles along the motorway. And it's about what they are, but they're all at different companies. So interoperability of charge points, so you don't have to sign up to 5 different companies, is actually what we need. But parts of Europe are doing way better than us. I guess the gold star goes to Norway, doesn't it? So if you manage to drive your car all the way around to Norway, they've got the best infrastructure.
Yeah.
Actually, in the centre of the universe called Sunderland, we've just opened a filling station with 6 rapids in, and it's contactless payment.
Yeah.
So you just contactless, take what you want and go, and that's got to be the way forward.
So if your car is empty, just drive up to Sunderland. That's the solution.
So ours are all contactless as well.
There you go.
But contactless costs more than interoperability. So in this time when we're not making money on them, having interoperability would actually help.
Okay. Let's have another question from, up here. There we are. I can't see you, but just shout loudly.
Hi, my name's Ben. I had a question on human rights, and in 2 parts. And I wondered, firstly, how would the panel think that we ensure that that our clean driving future isn't being powered and driven by child labour for cobalt, for instance, in places like sub-Saharan Africa? And then the second part, and I say this with the greatest respect, is why should any of us believe anything that Shell say on this when their chief executive, for instance, recently told us that climate change is the fault of people who choose to eat strawberries during the winter and are themselves facing criminal charges for repeated and systemic human rights abuse in Nigeria?
Okay. Let me deal with the first one first.
Yeah.
Who would like to take the first question?
Can I take the cobalt one?
Yes.
Do you not want the last one?
That's yours.
It might be funny, but actually this is quite a serious issue. These things come from potentially quite dodgy places,
Yeah.
the cobalt and so on, and we would need to be aware of that.
Yeah. There's a couple of things. I find it interesting that nobody was bothered about cobalt with their mobile phones or their laptops, and it suddenly became a problem when it went into cars. The second one is recently I looked up where gold comes from. And how gold is used in standard cars, it's used in all sorts of things. There's lots of children in some very dodgy places digging gold out the ground as well. It is a huge problem. There's nobody can get away from it. But one of the challenges is trying to open mines in other places where we can get it from. But it is really sad to say that if there is an illegal market, there's illegal markets in alcohol, there's illegal markets in drugs. If people want to illegally extract something and get it into the market, it's a problem. But what I think is the users, like my colleague on the right, have to certify where the stuff's coming from. And I think if we can try and certify where it's coming from, that will help. But bear in mind that just about everything we've got with a battery in potentially has got cobalt that some poor child dug out of a hole.
But just following up on that just very quickly, yes, of course, there are dangerous and dodgy practices going on for things we already use and perhaps we're not aware of. But this is going to be a real ramp-up of this industry. So how do we make sure that the next growth phase of this doesn't do the things that have been mistakes in the past?
In essence, the way I would put it is the amount of cobalt that can come from this dodgy side from children is pretty small. Now, one of the challenges we got, when I mentioned the battery chemistry, at the moment, we're trying to go from what people know as 622 to 811. What does that mean? It takes half the cobalt out. So Elon Musk has said now, I want cobalt out. So one of the challenges is that it's really, really hard to persuade somebody to open an ethical mine based on a chemistry that they don't know what they're digging out for. How do you do your business case on what you're going to put in? And the second thing came on the recycling. It'd be great to set up factories to do the recycling, but you can only set a business model if you know what you're going to extract from the battery. So the thing for our friends in Faraday is they have to decide what is going to be the battery chemistry. Because as I said when I was talking, it defines everything. It defines how many mines open, what we take out the mines, and then how we recycle it. And at the moment, it's just not defined.
Okay, and Joe, let's deal with the question that the speaker asked about. I mean, you must get this question a lot. Shell is an oil and gas company, and I asked you earlier on what's in it for you to be doing this sort of work in the future. You talked about survivability. But there are going to be people who ask the question, you know, why it just seems like an odd thing for your company to be doing, and what do you say to a questioner like that?
Absolutely. So you may not know, but actually Shell started life trading shells. That was the beginning of Shell. It started as a trading company. And our view is very much that we can trade anything. We can trade oil, we can trade gas, we do already trade electrons. We're one of the biggest traders of electricity in both the US and Europe today. My response really comes back to where I started and why I joined the industry, and that's because energy makes our world go round, and today that world is 80% fueled by fossil fuels, and 80% by oil and gas. We've got coal on top of that. So we need to be part of this transition. We're already one of the biggest investors in renewables and low-carbon technology. We invest up to $2 billion a year at the moment in low carbon, and we've just announced that we're going to increase that. But I think also in response to the question, if we're going to deliver the goals of Paris, it doesn't happen just by pointing at one sector of society. You know, we could point at consumers. Consumers are actually responsible for about 85% of the emissions. The production and processing is about 15%. We could point at government that they're not doing enough. And you're clearly pointing at us. But actually, we all need to work together to make this transition. And it's going to not just require us to transition our energy use, but it is going to require changes in our lifestyle. The Committee on Climate Change have been really clear on that. We are going to need to think more about how often we fly. We're going to think about whether we need a car in the first place and how we're going to use it. And we're going to have to think about what we eat as well, because they've been quite clear that a modest reduction in things like meat consumption is useful. So you don't have to listen to Shell. That's, you know, you're here, that's an option. I'm just telling you that I see a big role for Shell to play in this energy transition, but we can't do it on our own.
But isn't it also true that the amount that, not necessarily Shell, but fossil fuel companies in general are spending on cleaner technologies is very, very small compared to how much you spend on exploration, and that while the money's in the exploration, that's where you're going to put most of your money. It's a business after all.
So if we stopped investing in oil and gas today, then we would decline in production immediately, and we wouldn't have the oil and gas we need to fuel our lives today. So ongoing investment is necessary just to keep today's system running. That's why we're investing in oil and gas. But we need to invest in low carbon as well. And for us, it's a new business. You know, it's a big business at a couple of $1 billion a year. It's a big business, but it's a new business. And what's important for us in that is that we learn as we go. So you could say, well, would you put more in? We've just announced we're going to put more in 4 years after having launched the business. But what's important for us, and I think we're one of the leaders in our industry, but what's important for us is that we are able to show to shareholders that we can make money by doing this. It can't just be a charity where we're just throwing money at the problem and not making money in the process. Because if we do that, other companies won't follow us.
Okay, some more questions from this section here. Where are we? Yes, right at the front. And then we'll go to you.
So thanks very much, a very interesting discussion. It's one of the challenges, I think, with this future with electric vehicles is how do we make it for everybody, not just for the rich people? Not at the moment, it's frankly the poor people who are suffering most from the effects of the lack of clean fuels, whether it's for cooking, whether it's for the people who are breathing in the fumes of ICE cars and so on. And frankly, I don't see the current strategy doing much to help poorer people. Poorer people don't buy new cars. They buy, second-hand cars. How long is it going to be before second-hand electric vehicles are going to be achievable, at achievable prices? Probably quite a long time. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about what do we actually need to do in this country to make this something that's for everybody, not for the rich. As somebody, I forget the name, said, it's expensive being poor.
Okay, hold that thought. We'll take another question just there, and then you can each tackle one each.
Hi, hello. I had a question for the first speaker. So total new car sales in the UK is something like 2.5 million vehicles every year, if I'm not mistaken. On electric vehicles, there are a couple of £1,000s of subsidies and sort of the sort of goodies, and when you add it all up over the life cycle of the vehicle. If you look at the traditional ICE car, VAT, fuel charges, you have a couple of £1,000s of benefits to the government in terms of tax. So you go from a couple of grand of cost to a couple of grand of tax to a couple of grand of cost, times 2.5 million every year. If we scale this up, what can you talk to us about the impact on government finances and what that will do? And the extra data point that I sort of wanted to include in this question. So we've seen significant reductions in EV subsidies, both in Denmark as well as in Hong Kong. And immediately EV sales fell by 90%. So these things, they do need these subsidies, but we're talking tens of billions of dollars in terms of additional revenue loss to the government if this is truly scaled up. How's this going to work?
Okay, Vicky, I'm going to ask you to answer that in just a moment. Let's go from that end over there. Let's take whichever ones those questions you'd like.
Right. I think on the E4All, I think absolutely right. That is a key challenge, is developing that second-hand market and at all price points. A couple of points on that. I think you will start seeing EV prices coming down, which I think will help, particularly as we start getting increased volume and we just get some more vehicles out on the road. I think the role of fleets and fleet buyers is hugely important as a route of producing more and more vehicles onto the second-hand market. So I know that's an area that fleet operators have been looking at in particular, looking at how they can electrify their fleet that will have a benefit. I think the final point I'd make on that affordability point is different ownership models. So looking at things like mobility as a service or car sharing, car clubs that are looking at zero-emission vehicles and adopting zero-emission vehicles will be another route of doing that. On the public fund point, a couple of examples from elsewhere in Europe. One is around an idea of bonus malus, so where you use the tax revenue from more polluting vehicles, from ICE vehicles, then to support the subsidies and the support that there is for EV. And you've seen a number of systems in that. I know particularly Sweden's looked at that. So there are some systems around that. But I think longer term, and I'm sure Joe will have a view on this, one of the big challenges that the Treasury is going to have is what happens to fuel duty as we move away from petrol consumption and diesel consumption, which has been such a revenue earner for them.
Thank you, Colin. Colin?
It's interesting on the revenue one. I think there's only one answer, which is going to be road mileage. You simply pay for the amount of miles that you do. I can't see how that's going to change.
You could have a carbon tax.
Too complicated.
I tend to agree.
Vicky, too complicated to have a carbon tax?
So I might answer both questions. So, I mean, I think support what Peter says. I think we've looked in all angles at how to facilitate kind of the first-hand and the second-hand market within government. And I think we always come out with the fact that we subsidise the first-hand market because it feeds the second-hand market. There is an increasingly flourishing second-hand market. So I have recently purchased my first EV on the second-hand market. I was surprised at the fact that some EVs are reasonably affordable now. Particular brands are almost comparable in the second-hand market to a second-hand ICE engine. So I think, it is going to get there, but from government, we still see that we need to feed that first-hand market to generate that. On the tax question, others have given views on how you might tackle that. I'm going to do the normal dodge that a civil servant does, which is to say it's a matter for the Treasury. But I believe the Treasury did say in the budget last year that this was something that they were going to explore. So I'm sure it is on their minds, and I'm sure they are thinking about the various options available to them.
Joe, why is a carbon tax too complicated?
Well, a carbon tax is the ideal solution. An equal tax across the entire economy is the perfect solution
Addresses
to delivering
the finance question.
Yeah, and it addresses sort of all sectors equally. But we're a very long way off having it. And if we wait for that to be in place, it will just be too late. So it might be the ultimate goal, but I think we have to kind of make do with proxies for it in the meantime. So why are EVs almost competitive today and only requiring, a small, well, they could do with a bit more of a subsidy than the one they've now got, but a small subsidy. And that's because effectively fuel duty acts as a proxy for a carbon price. What we pay in fuel duty is almost more than the carbon price that we would be paying on fuel. So it's very effective.
It's not exactly the same, because the idea of a carbon tax would be to give that money back to consumers in some way. With a fuel duty, it just goes into Treasury to do whatever Treasury wants to do.
Well, that's arguably the same thing, because Treasury spends that money doing things that we need.
Anyway, that's a different conversation. That's a tax conversation. Let's have some more questions from the back over there. We can't see you, really. Oh, there's one right in the middle. Oh, there we go. And let's go for you, and then the one in the middle as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello.
Go for it.
Good evening. I speak as the owner for the last 3 years of a plug-in hybrid vehicle. You've already touched on the point of what you call interoperability, which is a real disincentive to use charging points. But there is another point as well I've noticed, which is the discrepancy in pricing between the different companies that provide charge points. In the last month, I've paid between £1.12 to fully charge my car. It only has a modest battery capacity, but as much as £5.65, which is just quite an extraordinary discrepancy. I'm actually trying to follow it up because I think somebody must have made a mistake. But that's between 2 and 3 times the price of petrol mile per mile. So my question is, does the government, I think you clearly do recognise the problem, but to what extent is there a will to actually do something about it? Because this, to me, is a market that clearly needs a degree of regulation, which doesn't seem to exist at the moment.
And over here, there's something in the middle. I tell you, the answer is a carbon tax.
Good evening, everybody. I'm just a guest here from Canada through the research from UK Innovation for Battery Research at Imperial College right now. And also I'm a battery producer, and we are working a lot over there. And I'm very grateful for all the discussions that you had here. Most of this discussion is in every country right now. This disruptive technology comes, and I'm going to add a lot of spice to all the discussions to supporting each one of the speakers here, because it's very interesting that to know, first of all, you miss the battery producers or professors of the battery industry from your panels, just to clear out a little bit of the difficulties to understand what is this technology means in a mobility and in a grid. There are lots of factors and elements that are working for the grids that is good for the grid, which is not good for the mobility, and vice versa. And then the second lifetime is very interesting, because most of these combustion engine, if you want to look at that, the lifetime of those cars maybe is 30 years, 40 years, 20 years, depends on the country and the mileage, but not for the EVs. The EV doesn't work that way. It's going to be changing the battery the same as many of these manufacturers. They are changing and providing the way that now every 4 years they are changing the whole battery. Now it's totally brand new cars. This is the way the system works. On the hydrogen, it's very interesting.
Before you carry on with your speech, can I just ask you, do you have a question?
I'm just supporting the things that they are adding. Because the hydrogen right now...
Maybe wind up quickly.
Mostly is for public transportation. As our friends mentioned, that it's electrical and personal vehicles has a lot of difficulties for that, even though Japanese are promoting it. But now it's just mostly for public transportation. But thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So the question over here was about differential pricing. Why are these things so expensive, and do you need regulation for that? Yes.
Frankly speaking, I don't know a single charge point operator that's making a penny. That's one of the problems. A lot of the charge for infrastructure was put in on totally inflated projections of how many EVs we'd have on the road. So lots of infrastructure is being put in, and people are trying to recuperate the cost. I understand the differentials. We give lectures on this, and it is a lot more complicated than I can't see it because the person who answered the question. There's a massive differential. But the problem is we've set up a network of private investors, and it is simply up to them to try to recover the cost. One possibility was, if we could wind the clock back 10 years, was to have a network of rapid chargers as a regulated asset. And it would have been part of the grid, and it would have been controlled that way. Therefore, the price could have been controlled. But at the moment, if you go to a Shell garage for petrol, or you go to Sainsbury's for petrol, it's a different price. And unfortunately, because of the mosaic, but what will happen is gradually the small operators will be bought up, and you will start to get a more regulated situation. But at the moment, it's people on a land grab to try and get the best sites to put the rapid chargers, and the question is, how long can they maintain them? And we're already getting feedback that a lot of these chargers are broken, and it's because of the sheer cost of maintenance and installation. As I said, it's 45,000 for a 50 kilowatt rapid charger. You need an awful lot of £5 visits to pay that back.
If I may add as well, there's been a lot of capital funding provided for chargers, but less OPEX funding, and that's why a lot of them, I think, don't work. But we also need to recognise that there's different types of charging. So we can charge at our homes, we can, if you like, slow charge, but at a higher rate than we do in our homes when we go to a shopping mall or a cinema, and then you can rapid charge on the go. And so I think it's reasonable to expect to pay a different rate for whichever version you're going, and the operator has to pay a different rate for the, what they've agreed to take off the grid for that. But I tend to think of it a bit like buying a coffee. And I agree, you shouldn't see, when we buy a coffee from Starbucks or somewhere, we expect to pay £2.50, perhaps a bit less in the northeast, perhaps a bit more in London. Oh, yes. If we make a coffee at home, we know it doesn't cost us anywhere near that. So I think it's right we expect to pay more on the go. We're paying for a service to be provided, and we do that in every aspect of life.
There's one thing I'd say about that, which is that the quality of your coffee is
much
different.
better.
Well, it depends.
Generally.
You can argue which one's better. But the quality of your electrons is the same.
But as we started off, if you go to a 150 kilowatt charge post, you are charging your car in less than half an hour. If you're charging it at home, you're doing it overnight, so you're paying for something. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's right. I think the issue that I think you're absolutely right about is that works where you have the ability to have off-street parking. For those of us who have to charge on street, which is me, living in London with no off-street parking, then it becomes a problem. But I think the main point to register is it's still much cheaper than filling the car with petrol. So a full charge at £5, £6 is still much cheaper than even half a tank of diesel or petrol in most vehicles. So the total cost of ownership is still cheaper for these vehicles. In terms of our regulations, as Colin said, the market is an early stage. Market forces will kick in. As uptake increases, prices will drop for charging. What we're more worried about is transparency of pricing. So it's not always obvious how much you're paying per kilowatt hour. And that's one of the potential regulations we could bring into force under the AEV Act of Parliament. And then again, it's one of the regulations we're seriously looking at whether we need to do something around that.
Okay, now we're coming towards the end. So what I'm going to do is ask for a few very rapid-fire questions and then get the panel to choose one or two questions.
There's a young gentleman there been trying
please.
for
So
about half an hour to get a question.
You've had your hand up for half an hour. Let's have you. And then someone over here. I can't really see. Oh, there we go. There's one right at the back there. Let's have that one as well.
I'm 13. My name's Iggy. I'd just like to interject on the hydrogen discussion. So you're talking about how explosive hydrogen is. Well, we can't ignore that on batteries. Lithium polymer batteries, they've been out for a while now. They're still incredibly unstable. Like, I've got my remote control car. I got it from a boot fair. But the battery that I use for it has got, when you're charging it, you have to take precautions, because if you charge that overnight and it goes bang, that's your house gone. And like, if you charge your car, you've put a lot of money into that, serious amount, and you're charging that overnight, and you're trusting a new battery concept that hasn't been fully tested. after a few years, it might degrade. That's your car gone. Unless you've got insurance that covers that specifically, then that's, I don't know how, like, if say you've got a brand new Tesla, that's your Tesla gone.
That's really bad. That sounds really bad.
And also with petrol, we're talking about hydrogen, it's flammable, but so is petrol. So with hydrogen, it's the same exact problem. I don't see why we can't handle this. With LPG, we've had this problem before.
Good thought. Hold that thought. We're going to go through the whole panel. Thank you. Question over here. Was there one at the back somewhere? Yep, one there. And then one over this side as well. Maybe you? Yeah. Over there, please ask your question.
Today we've been talking about how the population is going to be increasing in 2050 to over 20 million people.
20 million?
10 million, sir. 10 billion.
10 billion. That sounds more like it.
There is going to be also more access to people because we want to limit the poverty. We also want more batteries and them to be more efficient, but they're going to be useless without electricity, really. And we want also more charging stations, and we want less non-renewable energy, which represent 80% of our electricity production today. So the question I'm asking is, instead of focusing on stocking electricity, which was the topic today, shouldn't we be focusing on how to produce enough electricity with so many constraints we're going to have in the future?
Okay, thank you very much. And very final question.
The final question. Normally, legislation and regulation are 2 steps behind innovation and technology. So my question is, how ready you think is the UK grid to face a decentralized energy system based on batteries to charge, to store, and deliver energy? How ready we are for that?
Thank you very much. So there's 3 questions there. Hydrogen is nowhere near as, well, it's as explosive and dangerous as all the other technologies. Can we produce enough electricity, and how ready is the UK grid regulation-wise? You've got minus 10 seconds each to answer those questions.
I'll do that.
Start to that end.
Our experience on lithium-ion battery safety over the last 10 years, very few fires, very stable. It's not been an issue from that point of view. On the enough electricity, I think the answer to that is smart grids that actually are able to balance peaks and troughs, and electric vehicles give you that storage that allow you to smooth out the peaks and troughs. And on the decentralised grid, I think there's been some really good work that's been done by the government in terms of barriers to a decentralised grid. I think the challenge is going to be getting the market bit of it working well. You can focus on the regulation, but then how the market is going to operate in a decentralised world, I think is going to be a challenge.
Colin next, but feel free not to answer all the questions.
No, I'm not going to, just one.
Pick one.
Unfortunately, when we mention nuclear, we say Chernobyl. When we say hydrogen, we say Hindenburg. The point I was making was that hydrogen did not need an explosion now. So it's third in the pecking order of a replacement, and having an explosion now was not a good idea. The big problem with hydrogen is the cost and the efficiency.
Yes, so I think I'll echo what Peter said on renewable generation. I think the UK is actually doing a bit better than just 20%. I think colleagues would say we're at a third, and obviously we have plans to go much further because of net zero. Smart is the answer to helping load manage and get ready for mass uptake of EVs. And obviously Peter's already answered the question on the decentralised grid. I think we feel that we can be ready if the right measures are in place, and so the national grid.
So I will first clarify the metrics. So 80% of the energy we use today is oil and gas, but only about 20% of that energy is in electricity today. So we are doing much better at renewables in the electricity, but that's only 20% of our energy. We need to increase that electrification. So I talked about taking from 20% to 60%, but electricity isn't going to get us all the way there. We also need things like hydrogen solutions. We also potentially need things like district heating. You know, we need a multitude of solutions to this problem, but I think electricity is going to be the biggest, if not certainly one of the biggest, if not the biggest part of it.
Okay, well, we're 3 minutes over, but can I ask you now to put your hands together for our speakers, Vicky, Colin, Peter and Joe.